Exactly who should own policy about technology in an organisation?
I'm Alyssa Blackburn.
I'm Mike Loader. Tech Edge starts now. Welcome back everyone to Tech Edge, presented by the team at AvePoint, where every episode we delve into the latest industry trends for business IT and their significance across today's landscape. Now, with the rise of technology in the workplace, IT has taken on policing online conduct, leading to confusion and inconsistent rules that need clarification. Alyssa, this is an interesting topic you've brought to the program today.
It is, and actually I'm really so pleased to talk to our next guest, who has a number of really interesting takes on this. But I think it's also important to point out that when our next guest was in Australia recently, I sent him home with a box of certainly my favourite Bicky/cookie, the TV snack. And our next guest was kind enough to give me a bit of a rundown of the TV snack, including a policy statement that he disagreed with that said that TV snacks could only be eaten in front of the TV. Now, it is a policy statement. It's there on the box. They are TV snacks. You really can't eat them anywhere else. But is that the most appropriate policy for that?
Let's find out. Let's bring in our guest now to break it all down. Joining us is Lewis Eisen, policy drafting expert at Perfect Policies. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about technology opposed to chocolate bickies today, but I appreciate the thorough research you've done.
For sure.
All right, let's dive into it. So how has HR originally managed employee behaviour, and I guess why is this responsibility shifting to IT with the advent of computers in the workplace? Tell us a little bit more about the history of it.
Sure. Well, so when technology first started to come into the office, and you're talking, 20s, 30s, where we had telephones and typewriters and adding machines, it was HR who set the rules. Could you use the telephone for personal use? Could you use the typewriter in your break? All these rules were HR rules. And as computers started to come into the office, the people who operated them were basically part of the IT team. So it was a very tight-knit group. And even if you had like a word processing pool, they were still basically reporting up to IT. As desktop computers started proliferating, we've got IT going, oh my God, there's people using the machine that we don't control. We're going to need to set down some rules. And when they went to HR and they said, we've got some conduct rules that need to work into place, most of HR at that time was not particularly computer literate. So their position was, sure, go ahead, fill your boots. Do what you need to do, and fine, those rules will be fine. We have no idea what you're talking about anyway, and we're sure you're doing a good job.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can picture, I've been watching Mad Men again recently, and they bring in the typewriters and they bring in all the old technology, and the way we've evolved is incredible. So let's talk a bit about the main challenges IT departments face when tasked with enforcing acceptable use policies, given that policy enforcement is not their primary expertise. It's interesting.
Yeah, so I would even go further. It's not just that it's not their expertise, they're not equipped to enforce policy. They have one tool, and that is your account, and they can either disconnect it or threaten to disconnect it. But beyond that, there's really not a lot of punishment. They don't take away half your fonts or something like that. The mechanism for discipline and organization comes from HR, and it usually works across a grid where HR has a whole series of offenses, from the least serious, say putting gum under your desk, to the most serious, whatever that is, causing destruction or assaulting someone in the office. So there is a completely developed discipline process that runs through HR that IT is just sort of mimicking, but not really. We have the rules, but we don't have a system to deal with it.
So Lewis, I think there's an interesting point here as well about different rules for different circumstances. So we've got HR managing rules for offline behaviour, and we've got IT trying to manage rules for online behaviour. Now clearly, when we've got two different groups trying to manage essentially behaviour, but just in different parts of our lives, we get a whole lot of inconsistency. So what does that look like in an organisation, and where is that sort of causing some issues, do you think?
So very good question. A typical type of acceptable use policy might be something that says you're not allowed to harass other people. You're not allowed to conduct business that isn't the organization's business. You're not allowed to misrepresent yourself. all of these types of rules are not technology rules. They're true even outside the technology. So the fact that they sit in the technology itself, there's sort of this implicit, when using the computer, you're not allowed to harass someone. So we then have two possible scenarios. Either we have a competing HR policy, which applies outside the computer, or even maybe worse, we have a gap. So we have a rule against harassment on the technology, but we don't have any rules about harassing people in the hallway. So the acceptable use control has all of a sudden moved to the IT department.
Yeah, it's funny how you have to navigate these things, and of course business leaders as well need to be across all of this stuff. Are there any rules around acceptable use that can defensively remain in IT policies?
Yeah, I think so. And we have to start by looking at what the mandate of IT is. And I think the mandate of IT is not to control people, but to protect the information, protect the equipment. So if IT can identify certain activities, actions that negatively affect the equipment or the system, they absolutely can stop that or put whatever stops on it. For instance, maybe somebody's using more than their share of resources, or they've put a piece of software on a machine that shouldn't be on a machine, or they've opened a security hole, all the things that are actually technically about the use of technology. It's one thing to close somebody's account because the account has the potential to do damage. It's quite another thing to close somebody's account as punishment for not changing their password. That's a very different thing. And I think IT would do very well to actually pick out those actions which are really IT focused and spend its time enumerating, explaining those to people, and put the generic conduct stuff aside, give it back to HR.
So I think, Lewis, what you're really saying here, and I absolutely agree with you, is what we're actually trying to put policies around is behaviour, not necessarily technology. So if we're looking at putting policies around behaviour, we really have to ask ourselves the question of, well, is IT or technology the place that we would want to police behaviour? And I think you're making some really good points there. So if organisations are looking at this and then saying to themselves, okay, I think they're right here. This really shouldn't sit in a technology space. It does much more belong in a HR space. What are some things that organisations can think about if they're needing to transition that back, if they're needing to look at it and say, actually, maybe we didn't get this right. Maybe it does need to sit in another area of the organisation. How would they approach that? What would they do?
So there's two aspects to that. The first is a very technical policy drafting aspect, which is figuring out which items actually fit into the HR group. I would actually go to a lot of the HR policies and just make sure they include the words whether or not using technology, just so that all of HR rules include they're technology agnostic. So I would do that. And then the second thing would be to look at HR's discipline grid, look at how it decides there's certain offenses that are serious and not, and see if we can't slot some of those things into that grid. So that's one area. That's the actual mechanics of policy drafting. There's a whole second area, which I'm just as confused about probably as you may be, and that is, how do you change the culture? IT, in having the ability to create acceptable use policies, has power in the organization that it never had before. And that's a hard thing to give up. I can understand that, especially if they're concerned that if they do give up that power, there may be damages coming that they're going to be responsible for. So I don't know, I throw that back. What is the way to help balance that power in the organization?
Yeah, absolutely, and well said by you. So what is IT's role in the organisation when it comes to online harassment or, I guess, inappropriate website visits and things like that?
I think IT is an evidence gatherer, is what it is, and it ends there. The infraction of doing something improperly online is a business infraction, not an IT infraction. An IT infraction might be breaking into an account that you don't have, hacking account could be an IT infraction. But most of the behaviors, they're business infractions, and all IT's responsibility is limited to documenting, monitoring, collecting, producing, and reporting.
Yeah, detectives more than anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well. And it's actually something I hadn't thought about before, where IT becomes the evidence gatherer, not necessarily the enforcement officer kind of thing. And I think that's a really good point there, and something that organisations absolutely need to consider is what is the balance between those two things. But then we've got another side of that. Then, if this is going to transition back to HR, which I'm convinced, Lewis, you've got me. I'm on board. Let's get this done. But how do we get people to follow these policies? And I know obviously you do a lot in this space about making sure that we draft policies that people want to read. How do we ensure that we can do that, and that we actually get something out there, regardless of what area of the organisation it's coming from? How do we get something that people will actually read and then abide by?
So I'm actually less concerned with how they read, is that they want to follow once they understand what the policy is about. How do we write rules that speak to people, resonate with them, and they say, okay, yeah, I want to be following this. And the thing is that that's not just, policy is the most formal way, but it's not just a policy thing. You know, if the boss of the organization says, I want to report on my desk every Friday, everybody, let's see it in my inbox. That doesn't have to be a policy to be actionable, right? Anybody who doesn't do that can be disciplined. So the whole notion of getting people to do what they're being asked to do is a much larger problem than following the policy. And I think the danger that we have is when we put something into policy, we think somehow we have codified it so severely that we are raising the red flags if somebody breaks the rule. But in fact, we haven't fixed the enforcement process, which is what needs to be fixed. And I think I find in organizations, it's very easy to see actually, when you look at the IT acceptable use policies and you see phrases like, it is forbidden that, there's not tolerated that, really heavy phrases, that tells you that the policy enforcement process in the back end has been lacking. And so the policy writers, since they have no real power, they use the only tool they have, words, and they raise their voice. So figuratively speaking, they make it sound tougher and harder and louder. My concern is that doesn't create a collaborative situation. Okay, that's not a good way for IT to cement a good working relationship with people.
Yeah, I think that's very well said.
Yeah,
Lewis,
absolutely.
that's all the time we've got for the moment, but I want to thank you for joining us on the program, helping us understand and unpack this further. And as they say about sticks and stones, they break my bones, words will never hurt me, but we'll see how we go moving forward. Thanks again. There you go, some interesting stuff there.
Really good advice about what is behaviour and then what is monitoring, and who's actually responsible for both. So I think some really, really valuable insights there.
We will, of course, be back. Don't go anywhere. More Ticker coming up right now.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.